If you stepped into the Oval Office on a gray winter afternoon in 1946, you wouldn't find a president celebrating victory. You'd find Harry Truman staring at a map. Not a map of Europe, not a map of Japan, a map of the top of the world. The war was over. The parades were done. The flags were folded. But Truman wasn't thinking about peace. He was thinking about where the next war would begin. And his finger kept returning to one massive white shape in the Arctic, Greenland. Because Truman believed the fate of America might depend on owning a place most Americans couldn't even spell. Here's the secret Truman's generals understood, one that geography makes brutally obvious. If the Soviet Union ever attacked the United States, they wouldn't come across the Atlantic. They wouldn't come across the Pacific. They would come over the North Pole. The shortest route, the fastest route, the route with the least warning, and Greenland sat directly on that path like a shield made of ice. To most people, Greenland looked like empty nothing. To Truman, it looked like the front door lock to North America. But defense wasn't even the full story. The real obsession was underwater and invisible. Admirals had a name for the trapdoor out of the Soviet Union: the GIUK Gap. Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom. Those narrow, storm-thrashed waters were the only realistic exit for Soviet submarines into the Atlantic. If Soviet subs slipped through, they could threaten convoys, cities, even nuclear retaliation routes. But if America controlled Greenland, America could bolt that door shut. It could turn the Atlantic into something terrifying for Moscow, an American lake. And that's when Truman made a decision so bold it sounds fake. He decided to buy Greenland. Truman didn't want a lease. He didn't want a short-term agreement. He wanted ownership. He authorized an offer to Denmark, $100 million, and not in paper money, in gold, solid bars. A clean trade, ice for bullion. This would have been one of the most dramatic real estate deals in human history. If Denmark accepted, Greenlanders today might carry U.S. passports. The Cold War map could look totally different. But Truman wasn't making this offer in a vacuum. America had done this before. In 1917, during World War I, America feared Germany would seize Denmark's Caribbean colonies. So Washington approached Copenhagen with a bag of cash. Denmark sold. For $25 million in gold, the Danish West Indies became the U.S. Virgin Islands. Flags changed. Paper signed. Transaction complete. Truman looked at that precedent and thought, if it worked once, why not again? But Greenland wasn't just a colony. It was a symbol, and Denmark had just survived something that made symbols priceless. Denmark had been occupied, humiliated, forced to surrender in 1940 because there was no alternative. That national shame didn't disappear when the war ended. It hardened into a vow, never again. And that brings us to the man who complicated everything, a man who essentially ran Greenland from Washington, a rogue ambassador. Henrik Kaufmann. When Nazi Germany invaded Denmark, the Danish government surrendered. But in Washington, Henrik Kaufmann refused. He argued Copenhagen was acting under duress, so he didn't have to obey. Then he did something that stunned diplomats. He signed an agreement with Franklin Roosevelt allowing the United States to build bases on Greenland. Copenhagen called it treason. They fired him. They demanded his return. Kaufmann ignored them. For years, he became something like a king without a crown. And during the war, the U.S. built runways, stations, supply chains. By 1946, America didn't feel like a guest in Greenland. America felt settled. Retention hook, and Truman assumed Denmark would be grateful. He misread the moment. The offer moved quietly through diplomacy. Truman's man, Secretary of State James Byens, met Danish officials. The logic was presented like a spreadsheet. Greenland is expensive. Denmark is broke. America needs the island to defend the hemisphere. Then the number fell on the table, 100 million. Denmark could rebuild hospitals, schools, factories. Entire generations of recovery could be bought with that gold. But nations aren't businesses. A nation doesn't sell history the way it sells lumber. And Denmark's fear wasn't only pride, it was Stalin. Denmark was small, flat, close. The Red Army sat in Eastern Europe. Soviet power wasn't theoretical, it was nearby and expanding. If Denmark sold Greenland to America, Stalin could read it as a declaration. Denmark has chosen the American camp. And for a small country, that could mean pressure, intimidation, even invasion threats. So Denmark was trapped in a brutal diplomatic balance. Say no to America without insulting America. Keep Greenland without provoking Moscow. But while Denmark debated in hotels, the U.S. military wasn't waiting. It started building as if the purchase had already happened. In the far north, the U.S. began a project with a calm name and a massive purpose. Project Blue Jay, Thule Air Base, a runway carved into permafrost long enough to launch America's heavy bombers. From Thule, a bomber could reach Moscow and return. This wasn't just a base, it was a dagger on the map. And to make room for that dagger, someone had to disappear. In 1953, U.S. commanders wanted more perimeter, more space, more security, so the Inuit people were told to leave. Not gradually, not with choice. Days. They were pushed from ancestral lands to a new settlement far away. Hunters cut off from hunting grounds. Families separated from graves. For decades, officials insisted it was voluntary, but everyone knew the truth. It was relocation by power. And this reveals the real price of Truman's failed deal. Even without buying Greenland, America was already taking what it wanted. Eventually, Denmark refused, politely, firmly. Greenland, they said, wasn't merchandise. Truman didn't get his deed, but he was pragmatic. If he couldn't own Greenland, he would lock down the next best thing: permanent access, permanent bases, permanent advantage. Denmark said no to the purchase. But no didn't end the story. It just changed the paperwork, because Truman and the Pentagon didn't need a deed. They needed permission. And in 1951, Denmark signed a document that gave the United States exactly what it wanted, without calling it ownership. It was called the Defense of Greenland Agreement. On paper, Denmark kept sovereignty. In reality, the U.S. gained an open-ended strategic platform in the Arctic. Bases, flights, troops, jurisdiction over American personnel, a lease with no real expiration date. And once the ink dried, Greenland stopped being a remote island. It became a frontline. The 1950s weren't calm. They were paranoid. This was the era when both superpowers believed the next war would begin suddenly, without warning, without apology. Nuclear war wasn't a nightmare. It was a calendar event waiting for a date. So Greenland transformed. The glaciers became cover. The sky became a corridor. The island became a warning system. And the Americans weren't building for comfort. They were building for the end of the world. But the real battlefield wasn't the ice. It was the ocean beneath it. The GIUK Gap wasn't just geography. It was a bottleneck. If Soviet submarines wanted into the Atlantic, they had to squeeze through those harsh waters, through storms, ice, and NATO surveillance. So the U.S. decided, don't just watch the gap, dominate it, turn it into a net. And that net had a name, one that sounds harmless until you realize what it did: SOSUS. SOSUS was a vast network of underwater listening devices laid across the Atlantic floor. To the public, the ocean was empty. To the Navy, the ocean was suddenly audible. These arrays could detect a submarine's engine signature from extraordinary distances. In a sense, the U.S. gave the Atlantic a nervous system. If a Soviet sub left port, America could hear it. If it moved toward the gap, America could track it. And if it slipped through, America could hunt it. But this is where it gets darker, because the U.S. didn't just want to listen. It wanted to hide missiles under Greenland itself. In 1959, the U.S. Army began an Arctic project with a friendly public story. They said it was science, a research station, a test facility for building in ice. They called it Camp Century. And they built something that sounded impossible: a city under the glacier. Tunnels cut into the ice, steel arches, snow packed over the top. Inside, barracks, kitchens, a chapel, even a movie theater, and powering it all, a nuclear reactor. It looked like a futuristic miracle. But Camp Century was a mask, because the real plan wasn't to live under the ice. It was to turn the ice into a nuclear weapon system. Behind Camp Century was a classified plan with a name that still sounds like science fiction: Project Iceworm. The idea: carve a giant tunnel network under Greenland's ice sheet, and inside those tunnels, not science equipment, nuclear missiles, hundreds of them. The plan was brutal in its logic. If missiles were hidden under the ice, the Soviets couldn't easily target them. If they moved constantly on rail systems, they'd be even harder to destroy. It would be a nuclear shotgun pointed at the USSR from beneath the Arctic. And here's the key detail: Denmark publicly banned nuclear weapons on its soil. Greenland was Danish territory. So to do Iceworm, the US had to do what empires do best: keep allies in the dark. Retention hook, but nature did what rival superpowers couldn't. It sabotaged the plan. Engineers underestimated something simple. Ice is not stone. It shifts, it flows, it crushes. The tunnels began to deform. Walls buckled, corridors warped. The glacier was slowly reclaiming the base, squeezing it like a closing fist. Project Iceworm became impossible. And by 1967, Camp Century was abandoned, left to be swallowed by the ice. The world didn't know why. The Danish public didn't know why. And buried under Greenland snow remained a terrifying truth. America had planned a missile empire under the Arctic. Then, in 1968, the secret world cracked open because a nuclear bomber fell out of the sky. January 21, 1968. A B-52 bomber was flying near Greenland carrying 4 hydrogen bombs. It was part of a nuclear patrol program, constant airborne readiness. Then a fire broke out on board. The crew ejected, and the bomber slammed into the sea ice near Thule. There was no nuclear detonation, but the conventional explosives inside the bombs did explode. The weapons shattered. Radioactive material scattered across the ice. Plutonium fragments, contaminated snow, a nightmare spilling out onto the Arctic. And suddenly, Denmark's no nukes policy didn't look like policy. It looked like a lie. The cleanup operation was code-named Project Crested Ice. Men were sent onto the frozen ocean in brutal cold. They scraped contaminated snow into containers. They loaded it onto ships. They sent it away. Workers were exposed. Records were disputed. And the bigger problem wasn't the contamination. It was the revelation. Nuclear weapons had been operating in and around Greenland, which meant Denmark had either been deceived or complicit. And when the truth seeped out, Denmark's political world shook, because the scandal wasn't only American. It was Danish, too. Denmark was humiliated. Publicly, Denmark had insisted no nuclear weapons on Danish territory. Then the Thule crash made that promise look ridiculous. Investigations, protests, political fallout, and behind the scenes, quiet understandings and tacit approvals began to surface. The alliance had priorities, and safety didn't always rank above strategy. Yet the partnership didn't break, because reality was simple. Denmark needed American protection. America needed Greenland. So the scandal was patched. The Arctic stayed militarized. The map stayed the same. But here's the twist. Even when the Cold War ended, Greenland didn't become irrelevant. It became valuable in a new way. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the world exhaled. Radar stations scaled back. Patrols reduced. For a moment, Greenland looked like it might return to being what most people assumed it always was: ice, snow, silence. But geography doesn't retire, it waits. For most of modern history, Greenland's greatest defense was temperature. Ice made it inaccessible. Ice made it expensive. Ice made it irrelevant. Then the ice began to melt, not gradually, not politely, violently. As the Arctic warmed at nearly 4 times the global average, the ice sheet started revealing secrets that had been locked away since the last ice age. Shipping lanes, minerals, strategic depth. The island that once looked like a frozen liability suddenly looked like the center of the future. And the first thing to emerge wasn't gold or oil, it was roots. For centuries, ships moved between Asia and Europe through choke points. Suez, Panama, Malacca, all vulnerable, all slow. The melting Arctic opened something radical, the Northern Sea Route, a path hugging Russia's northern coast that cut shipping time by up to 40%. Suddenly, the top of the world wasn't a dead end. It was a highway, and Greenland sat right beside it, overlooking the crossroads of tomorrow's global trade. But shipping was only the appetizer. The real prize was underground. As the ice retreated, geologists confirmed what Cold War planners had only suspected. Greenland wasn't just ice, it was rock, and that rock was rich. Rare earth elements essential for electric vehicles, smartphones, wind turbines, and fighter jets. Uranium, zinc, gold, rubies, materials that define modern power. And here's the geopolitical nightmare. China controls over 80% of the world's rare earth processing, which means the future of green energy and advanced weapons flows through Beijing, unless someone breaks that monopoly. And that someone started looking very hard at Greenland. China calls itself a near-Arctic state. That phrase sounds harmless. It isn't. Beijing saw Greenland as three things at once: a logistics hub, a mining frontier, a strategic foothold. Chinese state-owned companies began making offers quietly at first: mining partnerships, infrastructure deals. Then in 2018, the move that set off alarms in Washington. China proposed building 3 international airports in Greenland. For Greenland, it was development. For China, it was access. For the United States, it was unacceptable, because whoever controls the airports controls the sky, and the sky over Greenland has never been neutral. The Pentagon didn't laugh, they panicked. Chinese-built airports meant Chinese logistics crews, Chinese maintenance contracts, Chinese civilian aircraft with military dual-use potential. Greenland wasn't just close to America, it was inside America's defense envelope. Washington sent a message to Copenhagen: this cannot happen. Denmark, usually cautious about Greenland's autonomy, stepped in. They blocked the deal. Then they did something revealing. They paid for the airports themselves. This wasn't generosity. It was containment. The Truman playbook updated. After decades of relative neglect, the U.S. suddenly re-engaged. A new American consulate opened in GIUK. Millions in aid followed. Cultural exchanges, education programs, investment discussions. No purchase agreement, no gold bars, just influence layered patiently. Greenland wasn't being bought, it was being courted, but Greenland wasn't just a passive prize. The people there were starting to ask dangerous questions of their own. Greenland today governs itself, but not fully. Denmark still controls foreign policy and defense. And Denmark still sends a block grant that funds roughly half of Greenland's public budget. That money keeps hospitals running, schools open, lights on. But it also chains independence to dependency. Many Greenlanders want freedom, but freedom costs money. And the fastest way to get money is to sell what the world wants: resources, location, access. Which brings us to the mine that nearly tore Greenland apart. At Quanarsuit, one of the world's largest rare earth deposits, Greenland faced a choice: dig and become rich, or refuse and remain dependent. But the deposit included uranium. Mining it meant radiation risks, environmental damage, foreign influence. The 2021 election became a referendum on the mine, and the anti-mining party won. The project was halted for now, but the pressure didn't disappear, it intensified. Because the United States had entered the minerals race directly. Rare earths aren't optional. They are mandatory for modern power. And Washington decided it couldn't outsource that future to China. So the U.S. began backing alternative mining projects in Greenland. Not through corporations alone, through national security funding, Pentagon investment, defense supply chains. Greenland's rocks became part of America's military planning. And then, Almost on cue, history repeated itself. In August 2019, Donald Trump reportedly asked a question that made the world laugh. Can we buy Greenland? Late-night comedy exploded. Diplomats rolled their eyes. Denmark called it absurd. But here's the truth. The question wasn't new. It was Truman's question, asked again, louder, clumsier, and in public. And while the words failed, the strategy worked. Trump's offer wasn't meant to succeed. It was a signal flare. And it worked. Washington realized it had been asleep at the wheel. China was moving faster. Russia was reopening Arctic bases. So America responded. Consulates, aid, military upgrades. The check bounced. The influence surged. But beneath all this diplomacy is an older, colder truth. Greenland's value hasn't peaked. It's just beginning. The GIUK Gap isn't just about submarines anymore. It's about information. Most of the world's internet traffic crosses the Atlantic through undersea cables. Cut those cables and economies stall. Markets freeze. Militaries go blind. Russian vessels now patrol near those cables. Specialized ships designed to reach the ocean floor. Greenland watches over that digital artery, just like it always has. History has a habit of circling back on itself. The Arctic was once the silent frontier of the Cold War, a frozen chessboard where no one wanted to make the first move. When the Soviet Union collapsed, that board was abandoned. Bases were shuttered, icebreakers rusted, patrols stopped. But now the silence is gone. Russia has reopened more than 50 Arctic military installations. China is testing polar-capable vessels. The United States is scrambling to rebuild icebreaker fleets it dismantled decades ago. Why? Because the Arctic is no longer frozen, and unfrozen frontiers don't stay neutral for long. Greenland is no longer a shield. It is the front line. At the northern tip of Greenland sits a base most Americans have never heard of, Thule. Now renamed Pitifik Space Base, it is not a relic of the Cold War. It is one of the most important military installations on Earth. Thule's radar doesn't just watch Russia, it watches space. It tracks intercontinental ballistic missiles. It monitors satellites. It forms the backbone of America's early warning system. If a nuclear missile is launched toward North America, Thule will know before anyone else. Which means Greenland is not just territory. It is time. Minutes of warning. Minutes to decide the fate of the world. And that makes Greenland too important to ever be allowed to drift away. Denmark is caught in a trap history designed for small nations. On paper, Greenland is Danish territory. In reality, Denmark cannot defend it. The Danish military has no Arctic Air Force capable of controlling Greenland's skies. No submarine fleet large enough to secure surrounding waters. No economy strong enough to bankroll Arctic infrastructure alone. Denmark relies on NATO. NATO relies on the United States, which means Greenland's security is already American, even if its sovereignty is not. And everyone knows it, especially the Greenlanders. Greenland has self-government, but self-government is not self-sufficiency. The Danish block grant covers nearly half of Greenland's public spending. Without it, schools close, hospitals shut down, social services collapse. Independence is popular in theory, but terrifying in practice. To leave Denmark, Greenland needs revenue, and that means choosing between three uncomfortable options: sell minerals, sell access, or sell influence. Every path comes with consequences, and the world is not waiting patiently for Greenland to decide. Neutrality is a luxury. It works only when no one wants what you have. Greenland has rare earth minerals, strategic geography, missile tracking infrastructure, access to Arctic shipping lanes. Neutral countries don't host nuclear warning radars. Neutral countries don't sit at the choke point of global trade. Neutrality ended for Greenland the moment the ice began to melt, which leaves only one real question, not if Greenland will align, but with whom. China wants influence in Greenland, but ownership, never. The United States will not allow a rival power to control the Arctic shield of North America, not diplomatically, Not economically, not quietly. If forced to choose between offending Denmark or confronting China, Washington will choose confrontation every time. Greenland is a red line, and red lines don't bend. Which brings us back to the question Truman asked nearly 80 years ago. Harry Truman wanted a deed. What he got was something more valuable: control without ownership, access without responsibility, influence without annexation. The $100 million check was symbolic. The real transaction happened through treaties, bases, radar systems, and silence. The United States didn't need to buy Greenland. It only needed to ensure no one else ever could, and that strategy is still working. By 2050, the Arctic may be ice-free in summer, shipping will explode, mining will expand, military patrols will intensify, Greenland will be richer, more contested, more pressured. The choices Greenland makes in the next 20 years will define its fate for a century. Remain tied to Denmark, move closer to the United States, or attempt independence under global scrutiny. There is no safe option, only survivable ones. Greenland has always been misunderstood, dismissed as ice, ignored as empty, forgotten as irrelevant. But empires don't rise or fall in crowded places. They pivot on margins, on islands, on gaps, on frozen places no one was watching. Whoever shapes Greenland shapes the Arctic. Whoever shapes the Arctic shapes the future. Harry Truman knew it. So does Washington today. The $100 million check was never cashed, but it was never withdrawn either. It changed form. It became bases, treaties, pressure, protection. The sale never happened. Yet somehow the influence did. Greenland was not bought in a single transaction. It was acquired slowly, inch by inch, decision by decision, silence by silence. And one day, long from now, historians may look back and realize something unsettling. The most important real estate deal in modern history did go through, just without the signature. Thank you for watching. If you want to understand how economies rise and fall, how wealth is created and destroyed, and what history's greatest cautionary tales teach us about our own time, make sure to subscribe. These patterns repeat, and understanding them might be the most valuable knowledge you can possess. We'll see you in the next one.